The United States boasts one of the world's most intricate, protracted, and costly presidential nominating processes. Every 4 years, presidential hopefuls engage in a series of state contests throughout the winter and spring leading up to the general election, all in pursuit of securing their party's nomination. Within these contests, either primary elections or caucuses, lie the coveted delegates, representatives of their respective states at national party conventions. The candidate who amasses the largest share of their party's delegates over these months claims the nomination and earns a place in the ultimate general election showdown. Many presidential aspirants commence their informal campaigning well over a year before the primary events in early voting states like Iowa and New Hampshire. In the year 2020, the primary season kick-started on February 3 with both the Republican and Democratic parties conducting their Iowa caucuses. Nevertheless, several states within the Republican Party opted to cancel their contests, citing the strong incumbent bid of President Donald J. Trump and fiscal considerations. This marathon of primaries and caucuses culminates at the national conventions in the summer when party delegates officially endorse their chosen nominee. Since the party's increased transparency in the 1970s, presumptive nominees have frequently emerged relatively early in the process, sometimes after only a few weeks of voting. What is a caucus? Caucuses, often hosted in venues such as school gyms and town halls, are local gatherings financed and administered by the two major political parties. At these caucuses, registered party members convene to discuss and show their support for various presidential contenders. Each party conducts its events with some differences. For example, in Iowa during 2016, Republicans cast secret ballots for their preferred candidate, while Democrats physically grouped themselves according to their candidate of choice before taking a head count. Democrats must garner a minimum percentage of all attendees to earn delegates, a viability threshold introduced by reformers in the 1970s to diminish the influence of smaller, potentially divisive factions. It's crucial to note that caucus participants do not directly pick a presidential candidate. Instead, they select delegates who will represent their interests and vote for their chosen candidate at the next convention level, county, congressional district, and state. The selection of delegates for the national convention occurs at the state and congressional district conventions. The caucus system did not evolve to serve a modern presidential nomination process but emerged in various jurisdictions to aid political parties in organizing at the grassroots level. Despite its antiquity, some states like Iowa continue to value this system even as most others have transitioned to primaries. What is a primary? In contrast to caucuses, primaries are held at standard polling stations, usually funded by the state and managed by state election authorities. In primary elections, voters typically cast confidential ballots in support of their preferred candidate. Two primary types exist: closed and open. Closed primaries restrict participation to registered members of the party conducting the primary, whereas open primaries allow voters unaffiliated with the party to participate. Before the 1970s, most states employed caucuses to select their delegates. However, after the implementation of reforms in 1972 aimed at promoting inclusivity and transparency in the nomination process, the majority of states transitioned to primaries. In 2020, only a handful of states, namely, Iowa, Kentucky, Nevada, North Dakota, and Wyoming, along with U.S. territories like American Samoa, Guam, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, are hosting caucuses. Why did the Iowa caucuses gain prominence? Several factors in the 1970s propelled the Iowa caucuses onto the national political stage. First, following the tumultuous 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, the Democratic Party enacted reforms to reduce the influence of party elites and open up the nomination process to ordinary members. Among these changes, new guidelines required states to select their delegates within the year of the general election, which meant that Iowa had to move its caucuses from their typical March or April date to January, preceding the New Hampshire primary. The extra time allowed for the printing of rules and materials for caucus attendees. 4 years later, Jimmy Carter, then a relatively unknown former Georgia governor, capitalized on Iowa's first-in-the-nation contest by winning unexpectedly, launching him onto the national stage. Carter replicated his grassroots campaign strategy in New Hampshire, achieving another surprising victory. Carter's strategic success in Iowa helped solidify the special status of both Iowa and New Hampshire in the presidential nomination process, despite the relatively small number of delegates at stake in each state. In 1980, the Democratic Party modified its rules to preserve Iowa's and New Hampshire's early positions in the nomination process, a move subsequently mirrored by the Republican Party. How does the delegate process function? In recent decades, states have vied to hold their primaries and caucuses earlier on the calendar, a phenomenon known as front-loading, to attract candidate attention and national media coverage. However, political parties have established rules to discourage front-loading and grant states holding events later in the spring a more substantial role in the nomination process. Both major parties allow only 4 states, Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina, to hold their delegate selection events in February. All other states and territories must wait until at least March 1st Street. In recent election cycles, over a dozen states have held events on this day, commonly referred to as Super Tuesday. Moreover, the Republican Party mandates that states with contests prior to March 15 allocate delegates proportionally, in contrast to the winner-takes-all approach favored by many state party officials. Who are the delegates? Delegates typically encompass party activists, local political figures, or early backers of a particular candidate. Presidential campaigns actively court these local and state politicians to secure delegates, as they often bring the support of their constituencies. Delegates may also include members of a campaign steering committee or long-serving members of their local party organization. How do candidates secure delegates? In Democratic primaries, candidates are usually awarded delegates proportionally. For example, a candidate who garners 1/3 of the vote or support in a specific primary or caucus typically receives approximately 1/3 of the delegates. Republican rules, on the other hand, exhibit more diversity. Some states allocate delegates proportionally, while others adopt a winner-takes-all approach, and some utilize a hybrid system. In past cycles, certain events, including the Iowa caucus, awarded no delegates and were intended solely to gauge party faithfuls' preferences. However, rule changes in 2016 compelled states to eliminate these non-binding events, often referred to as beauty contests. What is the turnout like? Generally, caucus turnout tends to be lower than primary turnout. For instance, in 2012, when only the Republican nomination was contested, Iowa's caucuses saw participation from 6.5% of all eligible voters but approximately 20% of registered Republicans. This increased to 16% in 2016 when both parties had competitive contests. In comparison, the New Hampshire primary witnessed a 31% turnout. For the 2012 general election, both states had turnout rates of approximately 70%. What are superdelegates? Both major parties reserve delegate slots for high-ranking officials who typically aren't bound to a specific candidate heading into the national convention, unlike pledged delegates. In the case of the Republican Party, this includes the 3 members of each state's national committee, representing less than 5% of the party's total delegates in 2020. On the Democratic side, superdelegates encompass not only members of the National Committee but also all members of Congress and governors, former presidents and vice presidents, former Senate and House leaders, and former chairs of the Democratic National Committee. In 2016, this group constituted about 15% of the party's total delegates. However, in 2018, the Democratic Party significantly curtailed the power of superdelegates in response to criticism that the system favored establishment candidates. In the 2020 race, superdelegates was barred from voting in the first ballot at the National Convention, participating only in subsequent rounds of voting if necessary. What role can independents play? Independent voters, being unaffiliated with any party, do not collectively receive delegates or hold their own national nominating convention. Nonetheless, many states conduct open primaries that permit independents to participate. Some states also allow voters to switch their party affiliation the day before an election, enabling independents to register as Republicans or Democrats if they support a specific candidate. Third parties, such as the Green Party, can select delegates for their own conventions. However, because third-party candidates typically secure only a small percentage of the primary vote, the candidates chosen by their delegates tend to attract limited national attention. What are the conventions? In recent decades, national conventions have mostly served as ceremonial events, primarily ratifying the candidate who has garnered the majority of delegate support. These conventions are typically organized as media spectacles to showcase the presidential and vice presidential nominees, party leaders, and rising stars. Over the course of 3 to 4 days, speeches and videos promoting the party's message are interspersed with official business, including the appointment of committee members, ratification of party rules, credentials, and policy platforms. However, in rare presidential election cycles where a clear front-runner for either party fails to emerge during the primary and caucus process, a series of votes at the National Convention may be required to select a nominee. While pledged delegates are generally bound to vote for a specific candidate in the first ballot, unpledged delegates may cast their votes for any candidate in subsequent rounds if allowed. This scenario has occurred infrequently, with the last instance taking place in 1952.